Number 5. Septic Tank Sam. April 13th, 1977 was a warm day in Tewfield, Alberta, which is a small town that had a population of about 1,200 people. On that day, local resident Charlie McLeod was installing a new septic tank on his property. He needed a pump, and he decided to use the pump from a septic tank that was behind an abandoned farmhouse on his property. He took the cover off the tank, and when he looked in, he saw a foot sticking out of the water. McLeod ran to his house and called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which often goes by the acronym RCMP. Officers with the RCMP arrived at the property a short time later, and using ice cream pails, they scooped awful-smelling water out of the septic tank. After about an hour of scooping, they found a body. The body was wrapped up in a yellow blanket and tied up with a nylon rope. The body was then dropped headfirst into the septic tank, which was 5 feet 9 inches deep. Lye had also been poured on the body to hurry its decomposition. The medical examiner determined that the body had been in the septic tank for several months, quite possibly a year, before it was found. Due to the lye and the amount of time it spent in the septic tank, it took months to determine even the sex of the body. It turned out that it was the body of a man. Since the man didn't have any ID on him, and the RCMP couldn't identify him, he became known as Septic Tank Sam. What they do know about Sam is that he died a horrible death. First, he had been tied to a bed and beaten. Then, he was burned with a butane torch and cigarettes. Next, he was sexually mutilated. Finally, he was shot at least twice, once in the chest and once in the head. When he died, Sam was wearing a blue Levi's shirt that had snap buttons, a white t-shirt with blue jeans, and wallaby-type shoes. He was about 5'6", right-handed with dark hair, and he was either white or native. He was about 28 years old, meaning that he was born sometime around 1949. Based on tests on his bones, experts think that he probably suffered a serious illness at the age of 5. Lastly, he probably worked as a laborer, and the RCMP think that he was a transient. Due to the brutality of the crime, the RCMP thought that the killer, or killers, knew the victim. They also think that the killer was local because he or she knew that there was a septic tank behind the farmhouse which only had been abandoned for 2 years when the body was found. The thought that the killer could be a local resident sent chills through the citizens of Tewfield. That meant that someone among them, quite possibly someone they saw and spoke to every day, could have been the person responsible for the gruesome murder. The RCMP put a lot of time and energy into trying to figure out the identity of Septic Tank Sam. They have spent over $1 million on the case and have had the body exhumed twice. He was compared to over 250 missing persons reports, and his dental records were sent to over 800 dentists in Canada. Despite all their efforts, the RCMP are no closer to identifying the body, and without knowing Sam's true identity, figuring out who killed him is next to impossible. The detective who originally worked on the case doubts that it will ever be solved, and Sam will never be identified. Number 4. Leah Sousa. In Canada, school resumes on the Tuesday after Labor Day, which is the first Monday of September. On Labor Day weekend of 1990, 13-year-old Leah Sousa of Cumberland Beach, Ontario, was enjoying her last days of vacation, and she was looking forward to starting high school in just a few days. In the early morning of Saturday, September 1st, Leah was asleep in her house along with her 36-year-old mother, Leah Sousa, and her 9-month-old brother, Michael. Sometime between 1:30 and 3 a.m., a man broke the glass on the back door of the family's home and let himself inside. First, he attacked Laura, striking her multiple times in the head with a blunt object, something like a pipe or a crowbar. The man then moved on to 13-year-old Leah. He sexually assaulted her and then dragged her into the backyard. Once outside, he beat her with the same metallic object that was used to strike her mother. The next morning, a young friend of Leah's came to the house to see if she wanted to hang out. She found Leah's body in the backyard and ran for help. The police and the paramedics arrived shortly afterwards. Laura was taken to the hospital, and luckily Michael was found unharmed in his crib. Sadly, Lee died in the backyard. Laura was hospitalized for nearly a month, but she ultimately survived the attack. The police believe that Laura saw her daughter's killer, but because of the awful injuries she received, she couldn't remember anything from that night. Over the years, Laura has tried various techniques to try to remember the attack. This included undergoing hypnosis, injecting herself with sodium pentothal, which is also known as truth serum, and finally, she saw an expert who used magnetic fields to tickle her brain cells. Sadly, none of it worked. Instead, Laura sometimes has flashes from that night, but she can't remember anything about her daughter's killer. In the ensuing decades since the murder, the police have interviewed over 1,800 people. One person they talked to several times was a man named Brian Elson, who lived in nearby Brecon, Ontario. 4 months after Leah Sousa was killed, Elson stabbed to death 17-year-old Sandra Bannister in Aurelia, Ontario, which is less than 8 miles away from Cumberland Beach. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and he was only sentenced to 6 years in prison. In 2010, the television news program, W5, did a story on Lee's murder. During their investigation, they learned that Elson's grandmother lived down the road from the Sousas. And at the time of the murder, Elson was staying with his grandmother. A reporter with W5 tracked down Elson to his home in Aurelia, and she asked him about the murder of Leah Sousa. He denied being the killer, and he said that he wasn't at his grandmother's home on the night of the murder. He said that he was at a party in a different town, and he had 60 witnesses to verify his alibi. As a result, he was never charged with the murder of Leah Sousa. Laura Sousa says that even though she can't remember the night that her daughter was murdered, thoughts about that night still torment her. Laura isn't the only one who is mentally scarred from what happened that night. The police who investigated the murder and the reporters who covered it say that over 25 years later, they are still haunted by it. They are all hoping that one day there will be a break in the case and the killer will be brought to justice. Number 3. Michael Kent. February 11th, 1966 was a normal evening for the Kent family at Port McNicoll, Ontario. The family drove to the arena in the nearby village of Elmvale because one of their sons, John, was playing hockey. It was snowing that evening, but nothing too serious. The Kents brought all 4 of John's siblings, and this included 6-year-old Michael. The arena was busy that night, and cars were constantly going in and out of the parking lot. Before the game, Mr. Kent helped John in the dressing room, while Mrs. Kent went and sat in the stands with 3 of their children. As the game started, the Kents realized that Michael was missing. The arena was searched, and Michael's little body was found lying outside beside a hydro pole near the parking lot. His chest and his back were covered in blood, and he wasn't conscious. His parents rushed him to the local doctor's office. His parents told the doctor that they thought he had been hit by a car. When the doctor removed Michael's coat, he made a startling discovery. Michael had not been hit by a car. He had been stabbed 3 times in the abdomen and 4 times in the back. Sadly, it was too late for Michael, and he died before the doctor could help him. The police searched the arena, and on the roof they found the murder weapon. It was a 4-inch steel fishing knife. The brutal murder horrified the quiet village. Violent crimes, especially murder, were rare in Elmvale, which had a population of less than 2,000 people. It was a village where people didn't lock their doors, and parents let their children walk to the arena unsupervised. But that all changed after Michael's murder. The police had over 50 suspects in the case, but no arrests have ever been made. What baffled the police and the community is why would someone do that to a 6-year-old? The murder appears to be completely motiveless. Michael was only missing for a few minutes before he was found mortally wounded. The police aren't sure if Michael was somehow lured from the arena or if he was physically forced outside. Once the killer had Michael outside, he stabbed him 3 times in the abdomen and then held his face down in the mud and stabbed him 4 more times in the back. Michael didn't show any signs of being sexually assaulted. What disturbs so many people about the case is why would the killer risk stabbing Michael in such a public place? The police interviewed over 120 people who were at the arena that night. Despite so many people being at the arena, no one saw anything suspicious. Over the years, tips have come in, and the police have followed up on them, but they are no closer to naming a culprit than they were 5 decades ago. The police say that the case is still open, but unless someone comes forward, the murder that shook Elmville will probably never be solved. Number 2. The Pauls family. It's September 1956. The Pauls family, which consisted of David and Helen and their daughter Dorothy, moved from Aldergrove, British Columbia, to a quiet street in Vancouver, British Columbia. The family lived a quiet life, but they were known to be friendly. In June 1958, David was 52 and he worked days at a warehouse, and Helen was 45 and she worked evenings at a deli. Dorothy was 11 years old, and the kids at her school described her as shy. Around 11:30 on the night of June 10th, David grabbed his keys so he could go pick up Helen at the bus stop because it was raining. When he walked out the back basement door, he was surprised by a gunman who shot him once in the head. The shooter then used David's keys and let himself into the house. He went upstairs and found Dorothy asleep in her bed. With a heavy blunt object, he bludgeoned her to death. He then went back to the basement and dragged David inside. Despite being shot in the head, David wasn't dead. The man proceeded to beat him with a blunt object, and then he shot him 2 more times in the head. The man then went back upstairs to Dorothy's room and removed her pajama bottoms. However, he didn't sexually assault her. Instead, the killer waited for Helen to walk into the house. When she did, he attacked her in the front hall. Helen was beaten with the blunt object and shot as well. The bodies of the Pauls family were found the next morning. The police had some evidence, like footprints and a bloody palm print, but since it was 1958, they needed a suspect to compare the evidence to, and they didn't have any suspects. The weapons were never recovered, but it's believed that the blunt object was quite possibly an axe, while the gun was a .22 caliber revolver, most likely a ROM RG-10 Colt style 6-shot. A big problem with finding the suspect is that the police had no idea what the motive was. One theory was that the massacre was sexual in nature, but there was no evidence of any sexual assault on any of the victims. Robbery was another possible motive because David's keys and wallet were missing. According to author Eve Lazarus, another possibility is that the family was killed by a serial killer who was stalking the area at the time. On April 3, 1958, 3 months before the Pauls were killed, 39-year-old Evelyn Rausch was killed not far from the Pauls' house. Then, on Christmas Day, 1959, 40-year-old Lila Anderson, who also lived in East Vancouver, was murdered. Both Rausch and Anderson were killed in a similar fashion to the Pauls family. Also just like the Pauls family, their murders are unsolved to this day. Number 1. The Children from Montreal. November 1st, 1984 was a dark day for the city of Montreal, Quebec. First, 4-year-old Maurice Vance was kidnapped from the Saint-Sud neighborhood of Montreal. Then, just hours later, in the early evening, 2 boys, 8-year-old Sebastien Metvier and 12-year-old Wilton Lubin, were kidnapped from the Hochelaga Maisonneuve neighborhood of Montreal. Maurice's body was found first. He was found 5 days after he went missing in a vacant lot. He had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death. Wilton's body was found in the St. Lawrence River a month after he went missing. He had been stabbed and his throat was slit. Sadly, Sebastien's body has never been found. The police assumed that the same person kidnapped both Sebastien and Wilton, but they weren't sure if he also kidnapped Maurice. A big reason they weren't sure was because Wilton and Maurice were killed in completely different manners. Maurice had been beaten with a blunt object, and Wilton had been killed with a knife. For 2 decades, the murders of the boys sat cold. Then, in 2014, a documentary called November '84 was released. In the documentary, the director alleges that between 1981 and 2007, one person killed not only the 3 boys, but 5 other children as well. He said that the killer was still alive and living in Trois-Rivières. In 2016, the police announced that they are reopening the investigation into the murdered children. Early in the investigation, they announced that 7 murders that are covered in the documentary, which happened between 1981 and 1992, may be connected. The only murder in the documentary that they don't think is connected is the murder of Cédrica Provencher. Cédrica was just 9 years old when she was kidnapped on July 31, 2007 from Trois-Rivières. Her body was found over 8 years later in December 2015, and at the time of this video, no one has been arrested for her murder, but the police do have a person of interest. The first case that they do think is connected is the murder of 12-year-old Tammy Leakey, who disappeared from Montreal on March 20th, 1981. Her body was found a short time later. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. Then, on November 1st, 1984, the 3 boys were kidnapped in Montreal. 8 months later, on June 5th, 1985, at about noon, 5-year-old Denis Rue Bergevin was kidnapped from his front yard in Montreal. His body was found 3 days later. There were signs of sexual assault, and he had been beaten with a blunt instrument. On January 20th, 1990, Pascal Poulin was kidnapped outside of a friend's home in Montreal. His body was found the following day on a riverbank. He had been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. Finally, on March 7th, 1992, Marie-Ève Larivière went missing while visiting some family in the Montreal suburb of Laval. Her body was found the next day, dumped beside some train tracks. Like 3 of the other known victims, she had been beaten with a blunt instrument. Also, just like the other victims who were found, she had been sexually assaulted. Not long after the investigation into the child murders was reopened in 2016, the police announced that they had a suspect in the murder of Denis Rue Bergevin. It was a man named Jean-Baptiste Deschenaux. Deschenaux had been convicted of murdering a 7-year-old girl in the Quebec City area in 1974. He sexually assaulted her and then beat her in the head with a hammer. He was released from prison in 1983 and he moved to Montreal. In 1993, Deschenaux was arrested for assaulting another girl, and while he was incarcerated, he was questioned about Denis' murder. He was asked to take a polygraph test, and he agreed. The night before he was supposed to take the polygraph test, he killed himself in his holding cell. He left a suicide note, and he did not claim responsibility for any of the murders. Since he is the strongest suspect in one murder, he may also be responsible for 5 of the 6 other murders. The only kidnapping murder that he is definitely not responsible for is that of Tammy Leakey. She was killed in 1981 while Deschenaux was still in prison. Sadly, that means there's more than one child killer in Montreal who has yet to face justice in this lifetime. Thanks a lot for watching this week's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. We post a new video every Sunday. And of course, thanks to everyone who already does subscribe. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We may even follow you back. The links are in the info below the video. But that's all for this week. Thanks again for watching.